Alexander Whitmore stood at the head of a glass conference table on the 42nd floor of a building that carried his family's name, watching a woman gather her belongings with shaking hands. She was his 11th assistant in 18 months. She would not be the last to walk out of that office believing she had failed, when in truth, she had simply met a man who could not be pleased. Alex offered no apology as she left. He never did. To the people who worked beneath him, he was a wall of ice wrapped in a three-piece suit, a man who inherited more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes and somehow still found reasons to be furious every single day. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly guessed, was that somewhere across the city, a woman was finishing her last day at a firm that no longer needed her, completely unaware that her next job would change the trajectory of a man she had never met. Isabella Romano had never lost a negotiation in her life. Raised in a household where dinner table conversations doubled as debate practice, she learned early that fear was simply a decision, and she had decided against it a long time ago. She had built a reputation across Manhattan's business circles as the person companies called when everyone else had given up, the fixer who walked into failing departments and walked out having rebuilt them from nothing. She had turned down offers from firms twice the size of Whitmore Holdings because something about this particular assignment felt different. Her recruiter had warned her, almost apologetically, that the position came with a reputation. 11 people had held the same title in under 2 years, and every single one of them had quit. Isabella had simply smiled and asked when she could start. On her first morning, Alex did not bother learning her name. He handed her a folder of impossible deadlines before she had even removed her coat, expecting the same reaction he always received: hesitation, panic, the quiet fear that told him he was, once again, untouchable in his own building. Instead, Isabella read through the folder in silence, looked up at him, and asked a single question that no one had asked him in years. She wanted to know why the numbers he was demanding made no logical sense for the timeline he had set. Alex stared at her for a long moment, unsure whether he was more surprised by the question or by the fact that she had not flinched while asking it. He told her to figure it out or find the door. She told him she would have an answer by the end of the day, and she did not waste a single word doing it. The following weeks became a quiet war neither of them spoke aloud. Alex tested her the way he tested everyone, piling on responsibilities meant to break her, dismissing her ideas in meetings in front of senior staff, expecting the tears or the resignation letter that always came within the first month. None of it arrived. Isabella absorbed every insult with a composure that unsettled him more than any argument could have, and slowly, without either of them realizing it, the dynamic in that office began to shift. Employees who once avoided eye contact with Alex started noticing that meetings ran smoother when Isabella was in the room. Deadlines that once felt impossible were suddenly being met, not because Alex had changed, but because someone had finally learned how to work around him instead of being crushed beneath him. Whispers began circulating through the building that the new woman on the 42nd floor might actually last. It was late on a Thursday evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, when Alex found Isabella still at her desk reviewing quarterly reports that were not technically her responsibility. He asked her, with more contempt than curiosity, why she stayed this long when no one was watching. Her answer was simple and direct, delivered without hesitation, that she did not work for the people who were watching, she worked for the results. Something about the way she said it, flat and unbothered, struck a nerve in him that he could not immediately identify. For the first time since taking over daily operations of his father's company, Alex Whitmore found himself standing in front of someone he could not intimidate, could not dismiss, and increasingly, could not stop thinking about. Richard Whitmore, Alex's father and founder of the company that bore their name, had been watching his son's decline in quiet desperation for years. From his office one floor above, he had personally read every resignation letter, listened to every complaint from human resources, and grown increasingly convinced that his son was incapable of leading anything long-term. What the staff did not know, what even Alex did not know, was that Richard had personally requested Isabella's file before she was ever hired. He had reviewed her history, her reputation for surviving impossible environments, and made the deliberate decision to place her directly under his son, hoping against hope that she might be the one person capable of surviving him long enough to change him. Richard was dying, though he had not yet told a single person in the building the truth of his diagnosis, and time had become the only thing he could not negotiate for more of. Rumors began spreading through the executive floor that Isabella was not simply an operations consultant hired through the normal channels. A rival executive, threatened by how quickly she had gained influence, began quietly suggesting to senior staff that she had been planted by a competing firm to gather information and dismantle the company from the inside. The claim spread faster than anyone could contain it, reaching Alex through a source he trusted, and for the first time since her arrival, doubt crept into the one relationship in his professional life that had actually begun to function. He confronted her directly, coldly, demanding to know the truth about who she really worked for and why she had never once shown fear of losing her position the way everyone before her had. Isabella did not raise her voice. She simply asked him a question in return, one that would linger with him far longer than his accusation ever could. She asked him whether he had ever once considered that not everyone who stayed close to him was doing it out of fear, and whether it had ever occurred to him that some people simply refused to let another person's coldness become the reason they abandoned something worth building. Alex had no answer prepared for that. He stood in silence, watching a woman who had every reason to walk away exactly the way 11 people before her had, choosing instead to stay and challenge him directly. It was in that moment, standing in an empty office with the city lights spread out behind them, that Alex began to understand that the story circulating about her was not the truth he needed to be afraid of. The real truth was far closer to home, and it was about to change everything he believed about his own father. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The truth came out on a rainy Tuesday morning when Richard Whitmore collapsed in his office and was rushed to a hospital across town, leaving Alex standing frozen in a hallway he had walked through 1,000 times without ever truly seeing it. It was Isabella who drove him there, Isabella who sat beside him in the waiting room when he could not bring himself to speak, and it was Isabella who finally told him the truth that Richard had sworn her to secrecy about months earlier. His father was dying, had been dying for nearly a year, and every difficult decision Richard had made regarding Alex's role in the company had been made with the quiet desperation of a man trying to prepare his son for a world he would not be alive to witness. Isabella had never been hired to spy on him or dismantle anything from within. She had been hired because Richard believed she was the only person capable of teaching his son how to lead before it was too late. Alex sat in that hospital hallway processing years of resentment against a man he had always believed was simply cold and unreasonable, only to discover that every impossible standard, every distant conversation, had been an attempt to force him into becoming someone capable of surviving without him. He thought of the 11 people who had quit under his leadership, the reputation he had built without ever questioning why he needed one, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something closer to shame than anger. Isabella did not offer comfort in soft words or forced reassurance. She simply reminded him that the only thing that mattered now was what he chose to do with the time he had left with his father, and that legacy was not measured by how many people feared you, but by how many people were willing to stay. In the weeks that followed, as Richard's condition stabilized enough for him to return home under care, Alex began making changes inside the company that no one expected from him. He personally reached out to several of the former assistants he had driven away, offering not just apologies but genuine opportunities to return under a leadership style that bore no resemblance to the man they remembered. Meetings that once ended in humiliation began ending in collaboration. Employees who once dreaded being summoned to the 42nd floor started describing an atmosphere they barely recognized. None of it happened overnight, and none of it happened without Isabella standing quietly beside him through every uncomfortable conversation, every moment of resistance from a version of himself he was actively trying to leave behind. There came a night months later when Alex finally asked Isabella the question that had followed him since the very beginning, why she had never once shown fear of him the way everyone else had. She told him, with the same steady honesty she had carried since her first day, that she had once worked for a man far crueler than he had ever been, a man who taught her that fear only feeds cruelty, and that the only way to survive someone like that was to refuse them the reaction they were hunting for. She admitted, for the first time, that there had been one night early in her time at the company when she had nearly walked away herself, sitting alone in her car outside the building, questioning whether the job was worth the exhaustion. She had stayed anyway, not because the paycheck demanded it, but because some quiet instinct told her the man behind the coldness was worth the fight. Richard Whitmore passed away peacefully 7 months later, surrounded by a son who had finally become the leader he always hoped he would grow into, and a woman who had never once needed the Whitmore name to know her own worth. At the funeral, Alex stood before the very employees he had once terrorized and spoke not as the heir to an empire, but as a man who had nearly lost everything before understanding what truly mattered. He credited his father for the lesson he never wanted to learn, and he credited Isabella for refusing to let him learn it alone. The company continued forward under new leadership in every sense of the word, built not on fear, but on the kind of loyalty that cannot be purchased, only earned through years of showing up when it would have been far easier to leave. Looking back, those who worked inside Whitmore Holdings during those transformative years often say the same thing when asked what truly changed the trajectory of a man everyone had written off as unreachable. It was never a business strategy or a boardroom decision that turned things around. It was one woman's refusal to be intimidated, arriving at exactly the moment a broken man needed someone who would not run. Would you have stayed if you were in her position, facing 11 warnings and a reputation built on failure, or would you have walked away exactly like everyone before her?